just a picture of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And I'm going to talk about tuberculosis. And when you guys think about tuberculosis, right? You think about a patient coming in with fever, cough, often for a long time period. But part of your challenge might be to diagnose the disease. And this is what we're going to talk about today. There are the slides. Just make sure that they're seeing that.
That's what I'm
on the other side
concerned with.
But what do you do if your regular sputum smears are negative? I'm just going to make this interactive until we have the slides. Residents. Just shout. What do? You think the patient has TB, your sputum AFB smears are negative. What do you do? Bronchoalveolar lavage. That's a good point. Are there some options before that? And first of all, how many sputums have you sent? 3. Are they induced or not induced? It just depends, right? So in New York City, we routinely induce because a lot of patients don't have purulent sputum production. You want to get the sputum from deep in the lung. You don't want to have spit. So that's going to complicate it. But there are diagnostics that we're going to talk about. And one of the methods that has been rolled out several years ago worldwide is a PCR-based method that has made TB diagnosis really, really simple. And it's called Gene Expert, where you put the sputum in a cartridge and it picks up about half of your smear negative patients, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about these diagnostics. Before I get there, I'm going to just do this a little bit faster. So first of all, this is where I'm coming from. It's in the Bronx. It looks very pretty, but surrounding are projects and very poor neighborhoods. This is one of our research buildings, but there are clusters of research buildings. That's the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And it is affiliated, like you are here, affiliated with the University of Arizona. It's affiliated with a hospital system, which in our case is Montefiore Medical Center, serving a predominantly really minority community, right? We have a quarter are from Latin America or other Hispanic-speaking areas. We have a large African-American community. We have lots of immigrants, lots of them from African countries and other countries in the Bronx and spread actually all over the city. But that also makes us unique with our research, and that also brings us certain diseases that you don't see in areas where you have less underserved communities, and TB is one of these. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about tuberculosis. Again, we're going to go faster than planned, and I would like you to feel free to interrupt me. And then we're going to talk a little bit about TB diagnostics. And then I'm going to get to TB biomarkers and what's happening there, because that's going to give you an idea of what's coming worldwide and what is important for you to know. So in terms of TB facts, right, a quarter of the world is infected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but that does not mean they have the disease. And that is critical. Most people don't understand that you have to distinguish between infection and disease. You can have an active infection equaling disease, but you can have a latent infection, and this is where this quarter of the world population is coming from. They are latently infected, meaning their immune system controls the bacterial growth, and 90% of them will be fine for the rest of their life. And I personally believe it's probably the best vaccine equivalent that we have, right? Because if you have latent TB infection, you can control your disease, your immune system is stimulated the right way, and you don't develop the disease. You know your immune system is controlling the mycobacteria. However, your risk of developing active tuberculosis. So when I speak about TB, I mean the disease tuberculosis, not the infection LTBI, latent tuberculosis, right? Two very, very, very different things. So the risk to develop TB is roughly 10% of a person's lifetime. This risk is highest during the first few years after infection. And this is where you want to capture those that you want to treat with TB preventative therapy. It's going to be the highest effect, not your immigrant who's been infected for 20 years. I know the guidelines are we should treat everybody. I personally would not take TB preventative therapy if I would be latently infected. And I see Nancy here nodding. I wouldn't take it if my body controls it because I think it's like a vaccine. So what is the problem? The problem is, A, you're going to get the disease if you're immunocompromised. Your risk is like 30 to 60 times higher. The classical example is HIV. But we also have a reservoir of people who get the disease we don't know why, right? And that is roughly 10 million people each year. These numbers were higher, came down, and since COVID, they're going back up. So these numbers is roughly 1 million with HIV co-infection, but the majority, 90%, are HIV uninfected. Over 1.5 million people died of TB in 2020, and that makes TB prior to COVID-19 the deadliest infectious disease caused by a single pathogen, and we will get back there as we have more control over COVID. So this is one of your number one global health problems. Oops, this doesn't move here. Go here. So this slide I'm going to skip over, but I want to point out that the numbers of multi-drug resistant TB and extensively drug-resistant TB are rising. I'm not going to talk about TB therapy today, but this is why it becomes an even more important global public health problem, because we're running out of drugs, even though we now have a couple of new ones. This is a map that has changed very, very little, and this is TB incidence. Now, for the residents, incidence is not case numbers. Incidence is the number per 100,000 population. And this is why the darker areas are down in sub-Saharan Africa, because this is where you have both epidemics, HIV and TB, coming together. And then it used to go up to over 1,000 per 100,000. And just as an example, here in Arizona, you are roughly 2 per 100,000, just in perspective, right? But the countries that have the highest burden, which means overall TB cases, are China and India. And this is driven mostly, it's just HIV negative people. These are the TB cases by origin of birth, so separated into US born and non-US born in New York City. And I'm sure here in the area it is similar. So we see these very high these very high numbers in the early 90s in New York City, and these were in US born, and they are so high because these were HIV infected people. And with the availability of highly antiretroviral therapy, these numbers came down, and now the proportions, it's mostly foreign-born individuals that have TB in New York City and in the US overall, because they are immunocompetent, but they still have a certain degree of reactivation risk over time. Just gonna highlight here, we are up in the Bronx where you see these darkest areas, as well as some areas in Queens and New York City. This is where mostly immigrants live, and that's why we have higher cases in these areas compared to Manhattan, where there's very little TB. What has COVID done to TB? So COVID has led to an increase in TB mortality, and the question is why? And this is why I put this graph here, because what you see is that with the start of the COVID pandemic, we have this extreme decline in TB case detection rates. TB didn't go away. TB is still there. It just wasn't diagnosed. So people, when they don't get diagnosed and they don't get treated in time, they die of TB because your lung gets basically destroyed. So the WHO estimates that TB incidence worldwide is going to increase. We will see TB coming back more than ever before, and probably decades of efforts will be reversed until we get a handle of it again. This was a little bit fast. I'm going to skip over this, but I just wanted to show you that in New York City, overall, the detection rate went down by 20%, but up in the Bronx, and this is a research project that one of the ID fellows did with me, over the Bronx, we saw a decrease in 40%. But then the cases that were admitted during the pandemic had signs of more advanced disease. They had more multilobar infiltrates. And we also see more ICU admissions now with TB. So it matches pretty much what the WHO sees, only that we didn't see a difference in mortality. I want to get to the diagnostics part. And I want to, because you guys are residents, and I thought this might be fun. So this is a case that I actually saw a couple of months ago, very, very recently, 36-year-old man who came from the Democratic Republic of Congo approximately 4 years prior, and who presented with intermittent fevers and coughs for like over a year. No significant past medical history, no smoking. He worked at a chicken farm, right, which sounds like a board question, and you are on the internal medicine boards. You worked at a chicken farm for 1 to 2 years when he came to the US. His labs were unremarkable, and he was HIV negative. By the way, the guys on the other end, can you see my slides still? Just want to make sure everybody's on there. Yes, okay, good. So this is his chest x-ray. Not really impressive, but when you look, you see a little bit of an left upper lobe infiltrate. This is the lateral. You can see the infiltrate a little bit better. And this is the CAT scan, right? So now you see the nodular infiltrates. You see the cavity, and it basically confirmed what I thought up front as TB, because when you run around for over a year with a little bit of symptoms, fevers, a little bit of cough, oh, by the way, he also had some weight loss, 10 to 20 pounds, that most likely is TB, because TB is not a yes-no disease, right? It develops over a longer period of time, and that's why we also often miss it. So the interesting part was this guy's first 2 sputums, AFB smear negative, induced, by the way, he did not have purulent sputum, were negative. But lucky us, the third had some AFB. And then we sent it for Gene Expert, and Gene Expert was MTB positive. But this is a classical post-bacillary TB patient, somebody with a good immune system controlling, but running around for a year with TB, possibly infecting others, but not highly infectious. This is another case, and this lady I saw a few years ago. I was just taking over as the teaching ID attending on the floor. A 40-year-old woman, originally from Zambia. She was known to be HIV infected. Her CD4 count was 270. She was on highly antiretroviral therapy. She had a known history of latent TB. She was treated for that with INH for 9 months, several years earlier, and she was 15 weeks pregnant, presenting with more than a week of daily high fevers, non-productive cough, headaches, dysuria. Chest x-ray negative, labs unremarkable, blood culture negative, sterile pyuria, right? So here is your red flag. There are very little, there are very few differential diagnoses for sterile pyuria, and TB is one of them. Patient remained highly febrile on broad-spectrum antibiotics. Renal ultrasound showed a right kidney with findings of xanthogranulomatous pyelonephritis, MRI, abdomen, pelvis, obviously without contrast, showed the pregnancy, but also some ascites, and again, right kidney abnormalities. Now you have no diagnostics, right? No AFB, no nothing. This lady is 15 months pregnant. Would you treat with IRPE? I did. And the fever went away. And there was my diagnosis. And then weeks and weeks later, we tagged the ascites, and we had also sent several urine samples. And then it took about 4 to 6 weeks for the TB bacteria, for the culture to become positive. You cannot wait in these patients. She ultimately lost the pregnancy, but not because of the drugs, just because she kept having these high fevers that only stopped when we started her on the treatment. So there are diagnostic challenges of TB, and this is what this talk is about. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of diagnostic developments and also about what's going on in biomarker discovery and where the field is moving. So as I told you before, TB can develop over months to years. You have to keep that in mind. It's not like flu, not like COVID. Yesterday you were healthy, tomorrow you're sick. No, you're going to have very insidious symptoms. And like that first patient was a classical example for on, off, a little bit here, a little bit of weight loss. Clinical presentation may vary, and they are dependent on the immune status of the host. You've seen this with the HIV positive patient versus the young HIV negative patient, and the diagnostic test performance is also going to be different, right? So you need to keep that in mind. This is from a publication that we published a little while ago in JID, which is the Journal of Infectious Diseases, talking about the need for definitions of subclinical and incipient TB. And basically, the important take-home message here is if you have a weak host response, right, you're going to have what is called subclinical TB. It's not my terminology, it's what the field decided to call it. And they are calling this particularly in the context of HIV co-infection. So you will have very, very few symptoms, not this pregnant lady that had high fevers. Severely immunocompromised patients don't get the same inflammatory response. They also don't wall off granulomas and have these cavities in the lung. They disseminate early, but they can be without fever and cough. So you're going to have a possibly unremarkable X-ray that says some hemadenopathy here looks almost like sarcoidosis, or you can have like some miliary infiltrates and you have extrapulmonary TB manifestations. On the other hand, if you have a strong host immune response, then you are going to develop your classical upper lobe cavitary lesion, which is very easy to diagnose. This is going to be sputum smear positive, or even if it's negative, you do the chest X-ray, and most ID docs will say this is probably going to be TB with a few differential diagnoses. So when this is still in its early stage and it is more incipient, then it's much, much harder to be picked up and to be diagnosed. So in the setting of HIV co-infection, you need to know that you have a high frequency of atypical infiltrates, low frequency of cavitation, again, because you don't wall off your granulomas. They are disorganized, yet you have a lot of AFB there. You can have these normal or slightly abnormal or atypical chest X-rays. You often have smear negative pulmonary TB. You have a high frequency of extrapulmonary TB, and they often lack symptoms, pulmonary symptoms, and you have an extensive list of differential diagnoses. So what are our standard diagnostic tools for TB today? You have your clinical evaluation, your chest X-ray, all of that is not really very specific. You have your sputum smear, and this is what you, if there's one take-home message for the residents, please know the sputum AFB smear has 50% sensitivity. That's nothing. That's a terrible test, a terrible test. So if your patient is smear negative, that means nothing. That means this patient could still have TB. It just doesn't have a lot of AFB in the sputum. And what means a lot of AFB? So in order to be sputum smear positive, you need 500 mycobacteria per milliliter. That's what you need. And if you are out in resource-limited settings and you don't spin and decontaminate, you need 1,000 AFB per ml sputum. So it doesn't take much to be sputum smear negative. On the contrary, your culture is going to become positive if you have 10 AFB per milliliter sputum. And then roughly you need 100 to be PCR positive. So even though our sputum culture is not really ideally the gold standard and 100% sensitive, in fact, actually only 75 to 80%. For the gene expert coming in, which our nucleic acid amplification assay picks up half of the smear negative ones, and now there is the expert ultra, which picks up roughly 65% of the smear negatives. Unfortunately, for some unknown reason, it's still not FDA approved, but it's used everywhere else in the world. And it's pretty cool. So you put your sputum here in the cartridge, you put this in some computer instrument, and then you get your readout, and it's all automated. However, you still need a lab. You still need money for these machines and these cartridges. So I have collaborations down in South Africa. They need to pay $40 per cartridge. That's a huge amount of money. So they typically don't even bother in their HIV positive population to do the gene expert because most of the time it's negative anyway. If they do it, they do only one gene expert, but we know the sensitivity of gene expert goes up with doing multiple sputums, just like your AFB. So there's a problem. We need better diagnostics. These are tools for diagnosing LTBI. Please don't use them to diagnose TB, right? Your tuberculous skin test and your interferon gamma release assay, which I'm not going to talk about today just because of the sake of time. This is like a topic for an entirely different talk. It diagnoses LTBI, and these are often up to 30% negative in active disease because they are T-cell based, and you exhaust your T cells during active disease. So our diagnostic challenges remain possibly extrapulmonary TB, TB in the elderly, in the setting of HIV co-infection, and in kids. Now, with regard to possibly TB, this is an old slide from the New York City Department of Health. Unfortunately, they don't publish it anymore, but as you can see, the dynamics don't change. This blue line here, the straight line, this is your sputum AFB smear positivity, and you can see it stays at 50% even with everything fancy that we do. Your dotted black line is culture positivity, and then your red line is actually who's being truly diagnosed with TB, and this is often based on empiric therapy or sticking a needle into some other organs and having some calcified, some necrotizing granulomas or so on. So what we did a little while ago, and this was one of the students who did the clinical research training program, and I was the mentor, Minh Vu Nguyen, he's now an ID attending at UC Davis. We partnered with the Department of Health in New York City, and we basically analyzed all pulmonary culture negative TB cases, and we found we only looked at HIV negatives because we didn't want to have the confounding of extrapulmonary TB and HIV with this. So we found 15% of all HIV uninfected patients diagnosed with pulmonary TB in New York City. And we looked at 800 patients had negative sputum cultures, and this is for 3 induced sputum samples. And these culture negative TB patients, in comparison to culture positives, had significantly lower proportions of cough, weight loss, any symptoms in general, cavitation, and so on. So why would this be important? Well, it's important because you're detecting likely very early disease, and it can be treated with 4 months instead of 6 months of all of these drugs. And if you detect that early and you treat it early, you obviously prevent transmission. But it also highlights the need for better biomarkers and diagnostics. So this is where I'm going to transition to the topic of biomarker. there's no doubt that there's an urgent need for more simple TB diagnostics. Like I showed you, the Gene Expert is the coolest technology that we have out there, but you still need the machines and the equipment and money. So the WHO wants biomarker based on multiple biomarker signature-based tests, ideally performed on blood or urine for active TB that might help meet their target profiles for point-of-care testing. And the target profiles for smear replacement are really unrealistically high. They want over 80% sensitivity compared to culture, and that means over 60% for smear negative. We just saw that barely the Gene Expert Ultra would meet that, but it's not really a simple, cheap point-of-care test. And then they want basically all smear positives detected, and that at an almost 100% specificity. They have some guidelines for target product profile for simple triage tests. They still want over 90% sensitivity, but they're going down with specificity 70 to 80%. So these are steep goals. They're starting to realize that they might be hard to be met, and they are in discussion with major stakeholders to lower that a little bit. But for me, when I write grants, I have to write something down that I don't even think I can achieve. So this is important for the data that I'm going to show you now for the residents and the students. This is an ROC, we call it receiver operating characteristic curve, or a synonym is area under the curve. You get a number. You see the green line would be an excellent number, and that would be like a 0.9 number. Down here, you have the false positive rate, which comes to specificity. And if you have 10% false positives, that equals 90% specificity. And then the true positives are the sensitivity. And if you have a 0.9, that means 90% sensitivity. So if you have a test with 90% specificity and 90% sensitivity, you are pretty damn good. Most tests are more like this red line here, which is good and would probably be equivalent to an AUC of 0.7 or 6.5. And then once you have this straight diagonal line, your test is totally worthless. But this is how all biomarkers, regardless which area, start out to be evaluated. And then based on these curves, you determine a cutoff. And once you have a cutoff, your test readout will be yes, no. I hate the yes, no readout because you're always trading sensitivity or specificity, but this is what then goes into clinical practice. This is just a biomarker review. You see a ton of biomarker papers, most of them very poorly performed, reviewed here. And if you look at the top one and you see this clustering up here in this really ideal AUC area, this is comparing very sick patients with advanced disease, advanced TB, to healthy controls. Should never be done in clinical research design. And there are now standards of diagnostic accuracy reporting where they say this is the biggest confounder of all, and you overestimate your diagnostic accuracy about like 4 times. Huge. And this is comparing more to other respiratory diseases. And there are one of these points, so these orange points here, these fat ones, are urinary LAM detection, and we'll get to this. I'm going to tell you about this because it's really a cool area that will change the world for TB, for sure. And then there are transcriptomic signatures, which are some of the other more promising points, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. And in terms of time, I have 7 minutes just for you guys to know, but I hope you're going to still stay a little bit longer because we started late, right? So urinary LAM detection. So LAM stands for lipoarabinomannan. This is a glycolipid antigen. It's part of the mycobacterial cell wall, but MTB also has a capsule where there's just arabinomannan that gets shed in vivo and in vitro, by the way, but in vivo, and patients can excrete it in the urine. And you guys here are in the histo Do you have a lot of histone here? No, you have Coxie, but do you have a urinary Coxie test? No. You do. Okay, good. So similar, right? You have an antigen that gets excreted in the urine, and you detect it and you diagnose your disease. And if the antigen is pathogen specific, you have a high specificity, which is where you want to start out, right? And then you want to have good ways of detecting that antigen, and that is typically with antibodies. They're called capture antibodies and detection antibodies. So the capture ones hold the antigen, and then you need to come in with another capture, and then you can detect that capture antibody, and you get a color or a line, like a pregnancy test. So this is a truly point of care test. Now, why haven't we heard more about it? Because the point of care test that is on the market called Determine TB, it used to be the company Alere. Now Abbott has bought it. It has really, really low sensitivity, and it only works in advanced HIV. I'll tell you more about it, but you can see how simple this is, right? Pregnancy test. So it has much, much higher sensitivity in HIV-associated TB, but very low sensitivity in non-HIV TB. And the correlation is inverse between sensitivity of the test and the CD4 count. Here, I would usually stop and ask you guys why, but because we are running out of time, I don't do it. So please think about it for a second. Why? So here you can see the sensitivity with the CD4 cell count. So what we have here is under 50 CD4, your sensitivity can go up over 60%, but you are not seeing the cursor if I do it this way. So the people, you go down here, and the reason is really, if you have disseminated TB, you're going to excrete more antigen. That was the answer that I know was in everybody's head, right? You can also have urinary manifestations, and then obviously you would also have either a lot of antigen shed. Typically, whole mycobacteria would be far too big to get through the renal system unless your renal system is already destroyed. Getting back to that original slide that I showed you, keep that in mind. If you don't contain the disease pulmonary, you get dissemination, but you have overall more burden. And that's the explanation. So we need better urinary LAMP detection tests. There is a very new, cool test out there called the Fuji LAMP or Silv LAMP TB test. This has been developed based on 2 new monoclonal antibodies. One was developed in rabbits and by a Japanese company, and this is why the name is Fujifilm, Silv LAMP, and A194 is a human monoclonal antibody that looks as if it's the best detection antibody so far. You still have not a really as simple test as the TB Detect with the lower sensitivity, which, by the way, was based on polyclonal rabbit sera. So these are now monoclonal antibodies. And this has led, so you have the silver amplification test, and now major stakeholders, Gates, FIND, everywhere in the world, the race is on for making the next generation. This is the 2nd generation urinary LAMP detection test. They are having some problems with manufacturing and reproducibility. They are now collecting all the monoclonal antibodies for urinary LAMP detection, and they have several manufacturers and developers who work on urine concentration, simple assays, and so on. The plan is to have, by end of 2023, the 3rd generation urinary LAMP detection assay that basically could be a true point of care test and detect most TBs irrespective of HIV co-infection, which would be pretty cool. So these are some sensitivities of the Fuji LAMP. I want to highlight that it is better in the HIV positives. You see it goes up almost to 90% compared to the old Alere LAM here and 25%. However, when your CD4 count goes over 200, and this is when you start looking like HIV uninfected TB, also you make cavitary lesions, you contain your disease pulmonary wise, your sensitivity goes down to 50% and below. And this is where it is in HIV uninfected patients and other clinical trials. I'll just put the numbers here because this was published in PLOS Medicine. There's another publication in Lancet on the HIV negatives with other assays. So my group is working on antibodies to arabinomannan, which is actually the highly immunogenic portion of lipoarabinomannan. We can get arabinomannan from the NTB capsule. We strip it, we go through several mechanisms, and then we get arabinomannan. And we work on this because we are making monoclonal antibodies, but also work with polyclonal antibodies showing that these have protection against TB. Different topic. A nice side product is that we are now in the race of the urinary LAM field, and we are giving our antibodies to major stakeholders and companies and so on. So this is lipoarabinomannan. When you have polysaccharides, they are not like proteins where you have fixed conformations. The polysaccharides kind of can change their conformation, and you have many orientations to the immune system. So we have a collaborator, Todd Lovery, who's in Taiwan, who used to be at the University of Alberta, who is one of a handful of biochemists making oligosaccharide fragments of NTB glycan antigens. And we put these on microarrays, and they allow us to really characterize our monoclonal antibodies in depth and separate them out into these different motifs, right? The top are called MANCAP motifs. If they have this little orange star here, this is called MTX, and this is what Mycobacterium tuberculosis has specifically. The non-tuberculous mycobacteria don't have that. And that S420, that rabbit antibody that I showed you in the Fuji lab, recognizes these three as 7, as 8, and as 9 here. And this is why it's also highly sensitive for TB. What we are doing, so we have characterized and published on 2. We make human monoclonal antibodies. We've made 2 that recognize different glycan epitopes. This was published in Communication Biology last year, work done by my senior PhD student who just graduated. And we've shown that these, in combination, one as a capture, the other one as a detection, work in urinary LAM detection, as you see here next to the sandwich ELISA, similar to some other really, really highly promising antibodies. And they can detect, this is just preliminary data, pulmonary TB and distinguish it from other respiratory diseases. Again, very, very, very preliminary. We are looking more into this, but we also use these human monoclonal antibodies to show that we can detect mycobacteria in MTB-infected mice better than AFB staining. We keep making more monoclonal antibodies. We now have 6 to 7. Here are 3. These 2 ones were just the ones that I published called TM and LIAM. And we now have PM25, which has a much, much, much higher affinity and also recognizes these MTX MANCAP motifs that are here in the orange square to the left for those of you who are online, and recognize these MTX capping motifs. And we hope that this will be very promising. We have some preliminary data that look great. And because I know that Cami is planned, and Ken Knox sent me this great link to the website, Center for Advanced Molecular and Immunological Therapy, right? Antibody-based therapy, thanks to COVID, is now out there, right? We used to have only one antibody for RSV and PEDS infection, but now we understand that it is feasible and it will be possible to treat many infectious diseases, hopefully. TB might be a little bit more complex, but we are hoping that it might be an adjunct therapy. So antibodies have shown protection. This is the antibody here in the middle, but I just want to highlight these work a lot through for intracellular pathogens through what we call Fc gamma RNA-mediated mechanisms. So this IgG constant region docks on, you see to the right here, the macrophage, right? It binds to the NTB bacteria, so the antigen specificity or epitope specificity is critical. This is for the variable region. The Y is the variable region up here, and down here the constant region. And then it gets taken up into the innate immune cells, the macrophages, and helps get in control of the TB growth, which the macrophage alone is not able to. So lots of promising developments. This is just an idea to give you, there are many antibodies that can work in the lung, in the blood, and so on. And there are many different antibodies. Some are good, some are disease enhancing, and others do nothing. Just because they are there and the patient is still sick doesn't mean they don't work, just to keep in mind. We are also working, and I put this on here because we have a collaboration with Arizona Biodesign Institute next door on pretty cool microarrays where they actually print the genes, the clones of the antigens onto the slide. They go over with a lysate, and then the proteins fold, and we use this to screen against all 4,000 proteins of NTB for protective antibodies, but also for biomarker work. And we have some pretty cool non-human primate studies going on in that respect that are currently under review. Serology can be used for biomarkers. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over this. We showed that it can be used in combination with the urinary LAM detection assay. There are blood RNA biomarker signatures. That's a field that's moving on. I still think it's not really that simple point of care. You still need to lyse the blood cells and do a genetic analysis. But there's now using that cartridge system from the gene expert to do a 3-gene host signature and just simple finger sticks. And I've had fascinating discussions yesterday at AU with one of your amazing biomedical engineers. And you can do a lot of things with cell phone and finger stick blood. They have shown good sensitivity and specificity, but they are not meeting WHO targets. There's also some regional variability, which might be an issue. And then we are working on host proteins, starting out with mass spectrometry, and we are now moving to simple diagnostic assay platforms. We have identified several host protein biomarkers for TB, and we have also shown that these detect HIV positive, smear negative TB, and we think they might be an adjunct here. This is one of the proteins called CD14, which is a receptor on innate immune cells that gets stimulated by lipopolysaccharides, and TB with the LAM excretes a lot. You can also get that stimulated in gram-negative sepsis, but that usually the patient looks different, so I don't think that will be an issue. And we have shown work now, just published a few months ago in eBiomedicine, that we can predict TB with these host protein biomarkers before you diagnose it clinically. So ideally, if you have your HIV positive population and they start increasing with their NTB infection activity in their body, right? You still need a while until you can diagnose the disease clinically because they need to have these clinical symptoms. So we had cohorts with blood 2 years before the actual diagnosis, HIV positive cohorts from the US and South Africa. And we were able, I'm going to skip over this, we were able to diagnose, to identify certain host proteins. These are classical volcano plots with annual change per year. And I'm going to show you some of these graphs. The data is very messy, but we are now doing targeted analysis. One is CD14 that keeps going up and then down in both US and South African is the black line. For South Africa, it keeps going up a little bit longer, and then some other proteins that go up and go down again. And we're now just looking at these and have a more targeted follow-up and also look at treatment response in cohorts in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We've also shown that these can be predictive if you combine several biomarkers. And from here, I'm going to go to the summary, and I'm only 10 minutes over, so we'll have some time for questions. So overall, I have shown you that the accuracy of TB diagnostics and biomarkers is dependent on the immune response of the host. I hope this is one of the key take-home messages, right? Don't think every patient needs to look the same. Look at, is the patient immunocompromised or not? And this is going to be for several diseases, right? It's not just going to be tuberculosis, but particularly important for those that are smoldering and difficult to diagnose. I've shown you that urinary LAM detection can serve as a simple point of care test and a simple point of care test for TB, but ongoing development of better assays is needed. I've shown you that host blood transcriptomics and proteins can serve as TB biomarkers, that the host responses could indicate increasing MTB infection activity at low antigen levels. And overall, really, these are all the beginning of larger clinical trials needed to move the field ahead, but they are happening as we speak. This is my lab and my people. They've really all contributed tremendously. Yan here in the front is my current fourth-year PhD student who's working a lot on the protective antibody responses and doing in vitro and in vivo work. Right next to her is Elise, who has just graduated and decided to go into industry for vaccine immune responses. She has done a lot of the work that I've shown you with the current anti-LAM monoclonal antibodies. And next to her is Devin, who was a postback in my lab and who just got his first authorship of a tremendous review on the current monoclonal antibodies against LAM available in the field and what they mean. Was just accepted in Trends in Microbiology, which is a big cell journal. And then everybody else, Isabel here is an MD who's now back in Germany. And here in the front, to the right from me is Ting Chen, who used to be my postdoc and is now junior faculty. Tremendously contributed to everybody's work here. And these are the people doing the NAPA array, which we now, our lab is the only other place aside from Arizona Biodesign able to do these assays because they are quite work intensive with custom made equipment. These are my acknowledgements, all the people, I've mentioned some of them, tons of collaborators, and my funding mostly from the NIH, but also some grant funding from the FDA. ARIS used to be a TB Vaccine Foundation and the Gates Foundation. And that's it, opening up to questions. Yes. So the question, So the question was for active TB, and great question, by the way, for active TB, where do you see these biomarkers coming in? I think we have our standard diagnostics, right? So twofold. And one is resource limited settings, and one is Ben or any other hospital in the US or in Europe, right? So in resource limited settings, what they really want is they want to get away from the sputum AFB smear because the patient needs to cough into a cartridge, right? That's already transmission risk for everybody around. B, you need several specimens. C, you need a microscope. And D, you need the technician hanging over the microscope and often looking there for over 10 minutes. That's a lot of time, and it also needs training. So in resource-limited settings, you want to have a simple point-of-care test. Either you can do it with some cartridge, which I think still needs too much money and equipment, or you have a blood test. We have these handheld machines, right? You guys all work with C-reactive protein. So, for example, CRP is being used as a TB biomarker. The problem is it's not specific at all, but you can measure it with a handheld machine. If you have a more specific blood marker or any other marker, you can have these handheld machines at remote healthcare posts. You can use it there. If you have a urine test, then that's the ideal situation, because you would have a dot that changes the color or a line that changes the color. Again, in resource-limited settings, you are going to sacrifice the sensitivity and specificity for a fast readout, because if your patient goes home and you haven't discovered the disease and you haven't treated it, that patient may die, right? Because they also might have to travel 100 miles or 50 miles or not come back. In the US, I think we are heading towards heavily PCR-based similar like your COVID, and we're just going to go for more and more sensitive tests. And hopefully the Gene Expert Ultra is going to be even ultra. And then combined with the urinary LAM detection assay, right? If we're not dependent on that simple lateral platform, we can use other means to have higher sensitivity for very, very low amount of antigen excreted. Other questions? Are you guys online still all muted?
We are muted, and I don't see it's in the chat or anything like that.
Okay.
Activity with other NTMs.
Cross-reactivity with other NTMs. So that's a question that we get all the time, and that's also what grant review panels are asking. It is important, in my opinion. Somebody with NTM doesn't really look like TB, and it's often also a different patient. But for the antibodies, it's going to be a critical point that these antibodies don't pick up the NTMs to the same degree like they pick active bacteria. So yes, it is being looked at.
Yes, they call it the Kansassia. You know, the Kansassia, the like.
Yeah, but you know how much Kansassia is out there in the world and how much TB is out there in the world. Kansassia is like probably 0.1 or less % of all TB cases. I would probably say 0.01 or even less. So while this argument is valid, because, for example, with the monoclonal antibodies, Kansassia has that MTX, but in a different place. So it shouldn't overlap, but it could. I mean, there are so few Kansassia patients that people haven't even looked at it. Yes, over there, blue shirt.
The last one you had was different market. 14.
Yeah.
So that obviously pretty non-specific to it. We're looking at more targets to build.
Yeah, so I think ultimately, when we go to blood-based biomarkers, what we know is every patient is different. So you don't want to rely only on one marker, because you might have to sacrifice sensitivity. I personally think, and this is what my grant application has, like a handful is feasible. Ideally, if you can reduce it to 3, that would be perfect.
And this one, but with the like a biomarker that combines a lot of markers, like so that was one with 11. It was 11.
Yeah, 11. That was so the question is combining so markers with multiple hits. The gene signature, the original gene signature. So very originally started out with 16, then it went to 11. Now they are down to 3. If you look at the genes, and that is the key question, I didn't put that in there. So gamma interferon is one of them. Gamma interferon is just not TB specific. So I want to see the data where it's really holding up against other respiratory diseases. They have had other respiratory diseases in these studies from Africa, West and East and South Africa. I want to see a little bit more data, yeah. But it's better than what we currently have if they can turn it into something really simple for readout.
Some of it, my concern would be, I guess, how much of the specificity you sacrifice with the increase in the sensitivity.
Yeah, so the WHO gives you the cutoff. It's they want for a triage test, right? So I think their diagnostic numbers are extremely hard to meet, but for a triage test, the patient comes to a remote health care post. You want to know, is the likelihood very high that this patient has TB, or can you send that patient home? This is why the sensitivity needs to be high, right? Over 90%. The specificity can be 70 to 80%. Right now, if I go to South Africa, it's like everybody gets empiric TB treatment. They have a fever, they are smoldering, don't respond to broad spectrum antibiotics, they get treated for TB. Probably at least 30% are not going to have TB. They're all HIV co-infected. They can have other opportunities.
Sometimes here that we see a lot of toxic that can perform very similarly.
Yeah.
But get a lot of pushback sometimes from other teams like that. For me, I mean, I was born in Mexico, so for me, I take cavitation relation and I have to rule out TB and I have a very high suspicion. Here, the first thing everyone thinks is they say cavitation relation upper low, they think of coxy.
Yeah.
So I want to rule out all the time, and I get a lot of pushback like, no, this is coxy, it's more frequent, and it's more likely, like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's the same way, right? The other way. If you go to South Africa, it is TB until proven otherwise. Here it is coxy until proven otherwise, right? So the point for the people online was there's an upper lobe cavitary lesion. Here people are going to assume it is coxy and they don't even rule out TB. And he gets pushed back when he wants to rule out TB. I think the moment you take a thorough history, if this is an individual from a TB endemic region, I would push very strongly for also ruling out TB because you just don't want to miss it. On the other hand, TB shouldn't respond to antifungal therapy. Question, right? I mean, it's all you don't want somebody to go home and transmit it, so you obviously need to keep a control over the patient.
Yeah,
Yeah.
from other like public health standpoint, I just find it easy to at least rule out that it's highly infectious. That I push more like get free smears and
Yeah.